Joanna Cherry.
Thank you very much, Mrs Lang. Today's debate is on amendments about our priorities for negotiation, the UK's priorities for negotiations for withdrawal from the European Union. And I want to talk about what Scotland's priorities are. But we also have the SNP put forward some amendments about the situation of Gibraltar. They're to be found at amendment number 54 and new clause 141, where we deal with the fact that this bill has omitted to include Gibraltar within its remit, which is rather curious, given the great love and affection that members opposite have for Gibraltar. And those of us who are members of the Select Committee on Exiting the European Union will have been very impressed by the evidence the Chief Minister for Gibraltar gave to us a couple of weeks ago, Fabian Picardo, where he emphasised that Gibraltar's main concern is to preserve its sovereignty and its connection with the United Kingdom, and that he was very happy, unlike some of us, to be part of the red, white and blue Brexit that the Prime Minister talks about. So it's very important that we take into account the concerns of Gibraltar. Well, I'm just going to come to the honourable gentleman to whom I'm going to give way in a moment, the honourable member for Ilford South, who has a long and admirable commitment to the people of Gibraltar and its interests. I believe has also laid amendments, in particular amendment number 29, which I'm sure he's going to tell us about in detail in due course, which would put upon the British Government a requirement to consult with Gibraltar before triggering Article 50. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful, and I'm not going to make a speech now. I hope to be called later. I just would like to emphasise that there is a very important need to protect the interests of Gibraltar. And whereas, as she said, that we are not referring to Gibraltar in this bill, it was of course specifically mentioned by an amendment when the legislation was agreed to hold a referendum, and the people of Gibraltar voted in that referendum. So surely we should have an amendment to the bill which accepts that Gibraltar's interests are also considered.
Absolutely, and I have here a letter from the Deputy Chief Minister of Gibraltar, who says that he can confirm that the clause on the application of the Article 50 bill to Gibraltar would be politically useful to Gibraltar, and it would also follow on logically from the original consent that Gibraltar already gave to the extension of the actual UK Referendum Act to Gibraltar. But I'll come back to that in more detail in a moment, Mrs Lang. Yes, I will.
Before the Honourable Lady moves on, I think it is important to back up the member for Ilford South in that the connection that Gibraltar shows to the United Kingdom and to being British Gibraltar especially should be reflected in this House. And I think members should think very, very seriously about supporting the amendment from the member from Ilford South, because it would send a signal into Gibraltar, and I visit Gibraltar, that they are respected here, and that members on both sides of the House respect Gibraltar. So please listen to the member for Ilford South when he speaks.
Indeed, and I totally agree with my honourable friend. And again, reading from the letter from the Deputy Chief Minister of Gibraltar, he says that he understands that our amendments mirror a number of others which have been tabled, seeking to make clear the application of the Act to Gibraltar, and that this would strengthen Gibraltar's case to be mentioned in the Article 50 letter. Now, of course, Scotland shares with Gibraltar a desire to be mentioned in the Article 50 letter, and the big priority for Scotland is that the British Government take into account the Scottish Government's request for a differentiated deal for Scotland. Now, Mrs Lang, we had a new clause about this, new clause 145, which would require the British Government to commit to such a differentiated deal before triggering Article 50. Now, we're not going, that's been held over till today, but we're not going to push it to a vote, because we are prepared to give the UK Government one last chance to respond to this document, Scotland's Place in Europe, which was laid before the British Government before Christmas, some 7 weeks ago. I will in a moment, before I finish my point, some 7 weeks ago, and to which no formal response has as yet been received. Now, my honourable friend, well, the honourable member to whom I'm about to give way, like me, is a member of the Exiting the European Union Committee, and we heard detailed evidence this morning from the Scottish Government's Minister for Negotiations with the United Kingdom about this document, a far more detailed document in its proposals than anything the British Government has been prepared to produce so far. And I'll give way to the honourable gentleman now.
I thank my honourable and learned friend.
for giving way, and I do hope she would treat me as a friend, as a fellow member of the Brexit Select Committee, rather than just an honourable member on the opposite side of the House. And I don't disagree with her when it comes to Gibraltar, and also maybe even Scotland. But we are acting on behalf of the whole of the UK. Are there any other places that, if there was to be a list of geographical places, such as maybe the Isle of Man or Jersey, would she like to see a long, long list of places listed in the Article 50 letter?
Well, the honourable gentleman is obviously not aware that the arrangements that apply to the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands are rather different than the arrangements to apply to Scotland. They're not in the European Union, so perhaps the honourable gentleman would like to read this document, which will explain that to him, and will explain that within the wider UK and Crown dependencies, there are in fact some differentiated agreements. Differentiated agreements exist, to go back to the case of Gibraltar. Gibraltar is in the European Union, but not in the Customs Union. But I'll return to Gibraltar in due course.
My friend will remember the direct quote from the Daily Telegraph, quote, Theresa May has indicated that Brexit will not be triggered a formal process for leaving the EU until there is an agreed UK approach backed by Scotland. Surely the honourable members opposite are not intending the Prime Minister to break her word of the 15th of July last year?
I'm sure honourable members opposite would be very loath to encourage the Prime Minister to break her word on this. And members opposite are shouting no veto. We're not asking for a veto. This is a compromise. This document is a compromise whereby Scotland could remain in the single market while the rest of the UK exits the single market. Honourable gentlemen opposite who are shaking their heads and mumbling about vetoes would perhaps like to get their iPads out and look up the difference between a veto and a compromise. It's rather a radical difference. I'm going to make some progress, Mrs. Lang. I'll make some progress and then I'll take some more interventions, perhaps from people who haven't yet spoken in this debate. The Scottish Government, as I've said, have put forward a proposal, and we're waiting for that proposal to be taken seriously. Now, the signs that the position of Scotland, the compromise we've put forward, is going to be taken seriously by the Government and indeed by this House so far this week have not been promising. Not a single amendment has been passed to this bill, despite the numerous amendments tabled by all sorts of different groupings within this House, many with significant cross-party support. And even yesterday, when the Government was forced into announcing a significant concession, they were extraordinarily reluctant to commit that concession to writing. And we all know why. We know it's because they don't want to amend the Act, because they have fought tooth and nail through the courts and in this House to avoid the sort of scrutiny that those of them who sought to leave the European Union have been trumpeting the rest of us about for years, telling us how fantastic this wonderful sovereign mother of parliaments is. But yet we are berated for having the effrontery to attempt to amend a bill. It's preposterous. No, I will not give way. We heard ample from the learned honourable gentleman the other day, and I will not give way.
Does the bidding.
This bill, Mrs. Lang, is being railroaded through this House with scant regard for democratic process. Here's an example. On Monday, when we were debating the amendments which concerned the devolved administrations, including Scotland, only one of my honourable friends got to speak. And when I attempted to double that tally, I was told to sit down and shut up and know my place. Now, Mrs. Lang, I don't mind being insulted and affronted in this House. But what people need to remember is that it's not just me, it's the people who elected me that are being insulted and affronted when I am prevented from speaking about amendments on which my name appear. Now, the honourable members opposite are extraordinarily relaxed about the effect that this sort of thing has on Scottish public opinion. I don't know if they take the Herald newspaper. It's rather difficult to get hold of here in the House of Commons. But if they do, they will see today's headline, "Support for Independence Surges on Hard Brexit Vow."
Going one direction, lads.
A backing, no, I will not give way. A backing for a yes vote in another independence referendum has risen to 49% on the back of the hard Brexit vow, and that's when no referendum is even on the table, and we are still seeking our reasonable compromise. Make no mistake, and it gives me great pleasure to say this, that the barracking of honourable members opposite and the preventing of SNP MPs from speaking in this House plays right into our hands and results in headlines for this: support for independent surgery. Mrs Ling.
Point of order, Mr Harper.
Mrs Lang, how can I correct the record? On Monday, when we were debating the amendments on devolution and the arrangements, and I spoke about the amendments that were on the paper, I seem to remember I took many interventions, including from the Right Honourable and Learned Lady. She wasn't therefore prevented from speaking, and indeed I seem to remember, Madam Deputy Mrs Lang, that the person in the chair at the time, well, you let me finish giving my point of order for the chair. When the person that was in the chair made great efforts to facilitate the Honourable and Learned Lady making a speech, there was then a kerfuffle afterwards when she objected to the amount of time she got. How can we put the record straight about the fact she had a fair opportunity on Monday?
Well, the honourable gentleman doesn't need to put the record straight because it's a matter of record. And I have myself looked in Hansard, and by the simple use of my arithmetical powers, I have worked out how many people managed to speak, for how long they spoke, what contributions they made. Now, the Honourable Lady is asserting that she was prevented from speaking because there was a time limit on the debate, and the Honourable Lady came quite late in the debate. Then there was not an awful lot of time left in which she could speak. But in saying that she was prevented from speaking, I think the Honourable Lady is making a rhetorical point rather than an arithmetical point, because the Honourable Lady's contribution to the debate has been considerable, and she will note that she has been given the opportunity very early in today's proceedings to speak. And I look forward to hearing the Honourable Lady speak to the amendments to which she has put her name, and that's what we should stick to. Joanna Cherry. I'm
very grateful, Madam Chairwoman, for your clarification, and indeed I am speaking early today because I'm leading for the third party in this House, as is my right to speak early in the debate. Now, the honourable gentleman opposite is terribly, terribly anxious to make an intervention, and in order to put him out of his misery, I'd very much like to hear what he has to say now.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable and Learned Lady. The point I was going to make in her remarks was on Gibraltar, and she was waxing lyrical about the importance that her party had to Gibraltar. It was just the fact that when I was listening to the evidence from the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, he was rather more committed to the continuance of the United Kingdom than the Scottish Nationalist Party, which doesn't seem to do so.
That's called democracy. The people of Gibraltar vote for parties that wish to remain part of the United Kingdom. The people of Scotland vote for parties that wish to be independent. I'm very, very happy. I'm very happy. Very, very happy. Very, very happy to endorse Gibraltar's right to self-determination, as I am happy to endorse Scotland and indeed any nation's right to self-determination. I give way to my honourable friend.
Just a point of clarity, it should be understood by all sides. Gibraltar is not in the United Kingdom. Gibraltar doesn't want to be in the United Kingdom. It wants an association with Britain, which is very different. The United Kingdom only dates from December 1922. Britain is a little bit older than that. Gibraltar does not have a member in this Parliament because it is not in the United Kingdom. It is an association with the United Kingdom. It is independent of the United Kingdom. That is something I would quite like for Scotland. British, but not in the UK.
Well, indeed, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend who has a long association with Gibraltar. I'd like the honourable member for Ilford South for clarifying the position for those who appeared not to be aware of it. Now, I'm going to come back to Gibraltar in a moment, but I'm just continuing on with the priority I want at the moment, thank you, the priority in these negotiations from the Scottish perspective. Now, the document I'm holding here, Scotland's Place in Europe, is a highly considered and detailed case which has been put forward to the British Government. And as I say, we're still waiting for any kind of considered or detailed response. This morning, the Exiting the European Union Committee heard evidence from a number of Scottish legal experts, in addition to the Minister, Mike Russell. And we were told by Professor Nicola McEwen that the proposals in this document are credible and merit examination. Now, really, what the Scottish Government is asking for from the British Government is no more than the British Government is asking for from the other 27 member states in the European Union, and that is for consideration in negotiations of our position. And our position is somewhat less substantial than the position that the British Government want to put forward in Europe. Now, I'm going to make a little bit of progress, and then I will give way to the Honourable Lady after I make a bit of progress. The Scottish Government is looking for a response to this document, and that's why we are not going to push new clause 145, which has been held over today, to a vote today. There's a meeting taking place this afternoon of the Joint Ministerial Committee, and we are still prepared to put faith for the time being in the promise which the Prime Minister made, which my right honourable friend, the member for Gordon, has just reminded us of, about Scotland's wishes being taken into account. But make no mistake, members of this House should make no mistake, that we will expect the Prime Minister to deliver on that promise. We will expect to have our position, just as Gibraltar wants its position, put forward in the Article 50 letter. And if that doesn't happen, if the Prime Minister breaks her promise, then we'll hold another independence referendum. And on the back of the Herald, things are looking pretty good for that at the moment. We're at nearly 50%, and not a single word has been uttered yet in the campaign for a second independence referendum. I won't give way for the time being, thank you, but the Honourable Lady is going to raise a point.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. She referenced the evidence session we had this morning with her colleague from the Scottish Parliament. Would she agree with me, however, that there were a number of unanswered questions that came through in that committee, including what regulations Scotland may be subject to if it was to be in the EEA, what the relationship, what the impact might be on the trade relationship with the rest of the UK, what the controls at the border might be or might not be, and what that would need to look like if Scotland had free movement but the rest of the UK did not, and also indeed what payment may need to be made by Scotland, how much that would be and where it would come from, over which there was some confusion.
Well, I don't agree with her, and the transcript will be available shortly, and when honourable members read the transcript, they'll see that my honourable colleague, who's a minister in the Scottish Government, repeatedly told members that the answers to the questions they were asking were in this document. It was rather surprising that one member of the committee at least admitted that he hadn't read the document, but was berating the Scottish minister for not having answered questions which are in the document which he hasn't read. Now, it's to be hoped that the British Government are studying this document and reading it. There's maybe quite a lot to learn from it. I'll take it into account.
Grateful to the honourable and learned lady. She very touchingly says that her document is a compromise document, but doesn't she and her party understand that a compromise document is one that she and I agree, and I don't agree with her document?
Well, I've got some news. I've got some news for the honourable gentleman. When the United Kingdom government goes to negotiate with the European Union, 27 member states, about exiting the European Union, the UK government will be looking for a compromise. At the moment, it's looking for things that the EU member states aren't willing to give, but that's not preventing the UK government from going into a negotiation. That's how negotiations work. Now, I would urge the honourable gentleman to read this document. If he had read it, he would know, as I had to correct him earlier, that although Norway is in the single market, it's not in the common fisheries policy, because what Scotland is looking for in this compromise document is an arrangement similar to that of Norway, which has I visited Oslo Oslo recently. The Norwegians seem to be doing pretty well on the back of that arrangement. It looks like a very prosperous and successful economy. And I give way to the honourable gentleman from Gordon.
Yeah, if the right honourable member, of course, had made the same pledge as the Prime Minister made, then I would expect, as a right honourable member, that he would have kept it. But I saw the evidence this morning, and I saw the Minister in the Scottish Parliament, Mr Russell, give the example of Liechtenstein and Switzerland. Liechtenstein in the European Economic Area, Switzerland is not. They have a frictionless border, let's put it that way, just like the border the Prime Minister promises from Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
Indeed. And many of the questions that honourable members in this House raised with the Scottish Government and with the Scottish National Party about how these matters might be managed are answered in this document, which is the product of research and consultation that has been going on in the many months since the Brexit vote, while the British Government has been going round in circles trying to decide whether it wants to be in the single market or the customs union. The Scottish Government has been looking at a considered compromise and answer to the dilemma in which we find ourselves, where the majority of people in Scotland wish to remain part of the European Union, but the rest of the UK wishes to exit. And I give way to my honourable friend.
My honourable friend made a really important point, I think, a few minutes ago, just about Norway and the benefits that could accrue to particularly my constituency with a Norwegian-style deal that would indeed help our fishing interests, but would also protect the interests of our fish processors and all the people who depend on export markets, most of which go into the European Union at the present time.
Indeed. I mean, it's no secret that of the minority of people who voted to leave the European Union in Scotland, a significant proportion were made up of people working in the fishing industry, fishermen, because they have received, as we heard earlier, such a bad deal over the years as a result of inept negotiating by the British Government, which Scottish Government ministers have been kept out of on the common fisheries policy. The great advantage of this compromise proposal for fishermen is that at the same time as coming out of the common fisheries policy, they would still have access to the single market. And believe you me, Mrs Lang, when I was in Norway recently, I saw a presentation about how the Norwegian fishing industry is progressing on the back of such an arrangement, and it is doing significantly better than the Scottish fishing industry. I give way to the honourable gentleman, the chair of the exiting.
I'm very grateful to the honourable and learned lady for giving way. Isn't the rather more fundamental difficulty with the proposal in the document that she's been referring to about the possibility of Scotland remaining in the single market, that there is absolutely no evidence that I have seen thus far, and maybe she has, that any one of the other 27 member states, never mind what the British government view is, that any one of the other 27 member states have indicated that they would consent to such an arrangement, given that all of the other parallels, the Faroes aside, relate to countries, and that is not the case in relation to this proposal.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising this issue, because it highlights the reason why I'm belabouring this point this afternoon. In order for Scotland to get the compromise deal that we are proposing, the United Kingdom government would first have to accept it as something they would then put forward to the other 27 member states. The other 27 member states are waiting for the United Kingdom to put its money where its mouth is and to come to the table and negotiate. They need us to sort out, to put our own house in order before we do that. Honourable gentleman opposite may not like it, but the Prime Minister made a promise to involve Scotland in negotiations and to look at all the options for Scotland. We are withholding our right to force our amendment to a vote today in the hope that the Prime Minister will be good to her word. People in Scotland are watching and waiting. This document has widespread support. It has the merit of uniting Leavers and Remainers because it has a compromise that appeals to both Leavers and Remainers. I give way to the.
I'm very, very grateful for her generosity, but wouldn't she agree that in the event that Scotland was in the single market and England and Wales and Northern Ireland weren't, then industry would move from England and Wales to Scotland to have a tariff-free access to the single market, and similarly, of course, industry will move from Northern Ireland to Southern Ireland, ripping open the peace process which has been denied earlier. It will be ripped open.
I think the SNP's position on the peace process has been made very clear in this House. We would wish to do everything to support it. Also, we don't wish to see the rest of the UK suffer as a result of coming out of the single market. That's why the principal suggestion in this document was that the whole of the United Kingdom should remain in the single market. Now, I'm terribly sorry for members representing English and Welsh constituencies that the Prime Minister has now ruled that off the table. But I'm sure those members will understand why we, representing Scotland, must try and see if we can get a compromise deal for Scotland. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the honourable and learned lady for giving way. Further to the previous intervention, does she recognise that if the government did accept that they could negotiate a separate place for Scotland within the single market, that could equally read across in respect of Northern Ireland and would be particularly compatible in terms of the Strand 2 arrangements and upholding the Good Friday Agreement in many important ways? It would actually go to the heart of upholding the peace, not upsetting any basis for it.
Indeed, and as usual, the honourable gentleman makes his point with great force and great clarity. But the difficulty is, this morning we heard in the Committee for Exiting the European Union from experts who've been observing the process of negotiation, as it's called, between the British Government and the devolved nations in the Joint Ministerial Committee, that these negotiations lack transparency and that they really haven't made any significant progress. And that is a matter of regret, not just for Scotland, but for Northern Ireland and also for Wales. I give way to my honourable friend.
Is my honourable friend as surprised as I am that there seems to be a suggestion that it would be to Scotland's economic advantage to be in the single market when we seem to be debating leaving the EU in the first place? Surely what's good for Scotland would be good for the whole UK in this respect.
Indeed, and we made it very clear in this document that we felt it would be to the advantage of the whole of the United Kingdom to remain in the single market. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister, in what my honourable friend, the Right Honourable Member for Gordon, has described as a very foolish negotiating tactic, has ruled that out from the outset. Now, I'm going to make a little bit of progress, Mrs Lang, because I'm conscious that a lot of other people are wishing to speak. And I did say that I was going to move on to deal with our amendments on the topic of Gibraltar. Now, as the honourable member for Ilford South pointed out earlier in relation to Gibraltar, Gibraltar was, of course, covered by the EU Referendum Act. If members look back to Section 12(1) of the EU Referendum Act, it extended to the United Kingdom and Gibraltar. And of course there was an overwhelming vote in Gibraltar to remain. But when Fabian Picardo, the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, came to give evidence to the Exiting the EU Select Committee, he explained that they've already got a differential agreement for Gibraltar whereby they're in the EU but not in the customs union. And this has been working well for them. And they would like to be involved in a BrExit deal that would guarantee continued access to the single market. But they don't want to be forgotten. And as I said from the letter I quoted from earlier, the Gibraltarian government support these amendments to get Gibraltar brought within the ambit of this bill, so Gibraltar's interests can be taken into account in the triggering of Article 50. Now, one question I have for the Minister when he sums up is, why has Gibraltar been omitted? Why was Gibraltar omitted from this Act? Was it, God forbid, an oversight?
Of course it was.
And if it was, then now they have the opportunity to correct that oversight with the assistance of the SNP. Or was it a deliberate omission? A deliberate omission? And if so, how does that deliberate omission of Gibraltar from the ambit of this bill sit with the assurances that the British Government has been given to Gibraltar that its interests will be protected? Now, I'm sure the honourable gentleman, the member for Ilford South, will speak with much greater knowledge than I can about Gibraltar. So I'm just going to say the purpose behind these amendments is to make sure that Gibraltar is not forgotten about. We feel there may have been an oversight, so we're attempting to assist there. If there hasn't been an oversight and this omission is deliberate, then we need to know why, and honourable members need to consider whether it would be appropriate to rectify that omission. Now, Mrs Lang, there are a number of other amendments today which I think would ameliorate this bill, and the honourable gentleman from the Labour front bench spoke very ably, if I may say so, about New Clause 2 and some of the other amendments. New Clause 2 I find slightly disappointing Mrs Lane, because it doesn't actually enumerate the interests of Scotland as a particular consideration to be taken into account. But again, I say we're not going to push our amendment on that to a vote this afternoon, because we're hopeful that there might be some fruitful outcome from the joint ministerial committee that's taking place today. And I give way to my
I'm very grateful, Honourable Lady, for taking Scotland into account on that point. And the promise of the Prime Minister on the 15th of July, I would hope, would have greater gravity than the previous promise given by a previous Prime Minister on the 10th of September 2014, when on the Channel 4 News, David Cameron said that if Scotland votes to remain in the UK, all forms of devolution are there and all are possible. Yet when it came to the Scotland Bill, by this time my honourable friend, my learned friend, was then a Member of Parliament, and we had the Scotland Bill. None of the amendments were taken, showing that none of the forms of devolution were there and none were possible. We've had one broken Prime Ministerial promise from one previous Prime Minister. Let's hope this Prime Minister can keep her word.
Yes. Yes.
Order, order, order. I give the honourable gentleman a lot of leeway, but we're discussing this bill right now. We can't go on to previous Prime Ministers and previous bills. But I'm sure the honourable lady, whose legal expertise is one of the best in the House, will find a way of saying what she wants to say. Ms Cherry.
Bringing my remarks to a conclusion, Mrs Lane, because I'm very conscious other people wish to speak. But I just wanted to make clear that the SNP does broadly welcome many of the other amendments that have been tabled this afternoon. For example, new clause 100, supporting amendments aimed at securing women's rights and equality. We believe that the EU is about more than just a single trading market. It's also about the social ties that bind us, and also about the social protections that the EU has guaranteed. Yes, I will.
I thank my honourable and learned friend for giving way, and on that matter of equality and protections for our people, does she agree with me that what we have seen thus far since we were elected to this place does not fill us with any hope that this government, when it has its great power grab, will uphold the protections that the EU has brought and will fight for our citizens' rights?
Well, I do agree with my honourable friend. It's a very real concern held by many parties in this House, and so we support any amendments that seek to underline the social aspects of the EU. Also, for example, new clause 166, which makes the point that about the rights of young people and the importance of young people's ability to live, work and travel and study across Europe has been of such a benefit to them. And of course this party fought for 16 and 17-year-olds to get the vote in the referendum, but that was not to be. Mrs Lane, perhaps the result might have been different if that had been allowed. Later on today we will also be voting on some amendments that were carried over from earlier in the week, including new clause 27, an SNP amendment about protecting the rights of EU nationals. And in conclusion, I'd just like to say something about that, and I think it's a view that's shared widely across this House, that we ought not to trigger Article 50 until we have given some sort of assurance to EU nationals living in the United Kingdom about their rights. And furthermore, we have had evidence in the Exiting the European Union Committee from representatives of not only EU nationals in the UK, but perhaps more importantly for some members of this House, UK nationals living abroad, who said that a unilateral declaration of goodwill from the British government, who after all has caused the problem by holding the referendum and allowing the leave vote to happen, a unilateral undertaking to guarantee the rights of EU nationals in the United Kingdom, and the feeling of the witnesses was that that would be met with a reciprocal undertaking from other member states, rather than using individual human beings as bargaining chips.
Bargaining chips.
Stand up.
Bargaining.
If the honourable gentleman wants to make an intervention, I'll be happy to take it, but I am bringing my... well, he obviously doesn't, just wants to shout at me from a sedentary position.
Bad manners.
Finally, Mrs Lane, before the second reading of this bill, I raised a point of order about the statement the Secretary of State has made under Section 19(1)(a) of the Human Rights Act, saying that in his view the provisions of this bill are compatible with convention rights. I wasn't not normally in the habit of giving out free legal advice, but I'm happy to do so on this occasion, which is that if this bill proceeds and if we trigger Article 50 without taking any steps to protect the rights of EU nationals living in the UK, then the British Government could find itself faced with a challenge under the Human Rights Act to the compatibility of this Act with Article 8 and Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and possibly claims. Now, I know that many honourable members opposite don't hold any great affection for the European Convention on Human Rights, but for the time being, even when we exit the European Union, we're still going to be signatories to it, and the British courts will still be bound by it. So I'm really just offering a helpful word of warning to the government, if they want to save some taxpayers' money, that they might want to think very carefully about addressing this issue before they're met with a slew of legal claims. And I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank my honourable and learned friend for giving way. And of course, one of the key workers in our society, both in research and in industry, are EU nationals in science and research. And these world-class researchers, we should be begging them to stay. We should be bending over backwards instead of using them as bargaining chip, because what we are damaging here is goodwill and how they feel valued in our society.
Indeed, and I know my honourable friend takes a great interest in the teaching and research into science, which was her own field before she came into Parliament. And she, like me, will be aware that many Scottish universities, including Heriot-Watt and Napier in my own constituency of Edinburgh South West, are extremely concerned about the brain drain that could occur as a result of the failure to reassure European Union nationals living in the UK in relation to their rights. So with that, Mrs Lang, I move Amendment 54, a new clause 141 in relation to Gibraltar, on behalf of the Scottish National Party. Thank you.